Welcome to the Families in British India Society podcast series. This is a recording of a talk given at our annual general meeting in November 2009 by Allan Stanistreet about medals for service in India.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very gratifying to see such a large audience here today. If you'd like to talk among yourselves for a minute or two, I've got some props to put out to help illustrate this talk. There are no pictures, you'll be pleased to hear, but I've got some real live exhibits for you to have a look at. Also, it's a bit of an experiment on my part. Right, I brought a script, not because I don't know it, but some might argue differently, but so I don't forget anything really. And so I'm going to read it because I've timed myself and it should last about 40 minutes. And those who are not fast asleep by then can ask questions and I'll do the best I can. The subject of orders, decorations and medals is a vast one, and even confining it to those awarded for service in India, one can only hope to cover it superficially in the time we've got now. However, I'll do my best. I brought along a few examples which I hope will add interest to the proceedings, together with biographical notes where I have them. They're all in the green folder. I should be pleased to try and answer any questions there may be at the end of the presentation. And anybody who wants to come up and have a look at the medals and the documents that go with them is welcome to do so, but as the chairman said, they're all counted and I'd like to take them all home again. I'm going to use the term medal to cover the subject generally, to avoid tedious repetition of the full description of orders, decorations and medals. Medals have been awarded for service in India since that for the Deccan for 1778 to 84, so it's an awful long time. Indeed, since then, no fewer than 24 separate campaign medals have been awarded for the theatre. Of these 24 medals, 4 are known as India General Service Medals. These are 2 of them. And between them, the last one, the last India Service Medal was issued for the Second World War, 1939-45. And between them, these India General Service Medals carry clasps, engagement clasps, no fewer than 44 different operations. That engagement clasps are these things here, above the medal itself. Whilst all British orders were available to those who served in India, and here we include, I'm including the British element of the Indian Army and the Indian Civil Administration and the native element of it. 2 were created especially for the people who served there, both service personnel and civilians. These were the Most Exalted Order of the Star of India, instituted in 1861, and the Most Eminent Order of the Indian Empire, instituted in 1878. The former was usually considered to be the superior of the 2 and ranks just before it in the order of precedence. There was a third order, the Imperial Order of the Crown of India, which was instituted in 1878, but this was strictly confined to British and Indian female royalty and the wives of such august personages as the Governor-General, later the Viceroy, and the Governors of Madras and Bombay. Her Majesty the Queen is the only surviving member of the Order of the Crown of India. All the British decorations for gallantry were available for British personnel serving in India. This included our civilian decorations and medals, such as the Albert and Edward medals, both of which were awarded to British and Indian recipients. In addition, gallantry awards were created specifically for Indian personnel, and these included, in the order of precedence, the Indian Order of Merit, 1837, which was originally called the Order of Merit, but when the Order of Merit was instituted in this country in 1902, the title of the Indian Order was changed to the Indian Order of Merit to avoid confusion. The Indian Order of Merit had 3 classes. It was followed by the Order of British India in 1837 in 2 classes, the Indian Distinguished Service Medal in 1907, and the Indian Police Medal in 1932. All these orders and decorations and medals peculiar to India became obsolete, of course, upon independence being granted in 1947. Medals could also be awarded for long service and good conduct, and whilst the British received their own awards, special ones were created for Indian personnel. There were at least 7 of these, some being for officers and some for non-commissioned ranks. Added to these were at least 14 medals of one kind or another issued for assorted royal durbars and visits to India between 1877 and 1911. Indian citizens might also qualify for the award of the Standard Issue Jubilee 1935 and Coronation 1937 medals. As you will all be aware, the British could not have administered India as successfully as they did without the assistance of the large Anglo-Indian community. These people were employed particularly in every grade of the civilian administration as well as in the armed forces, but especially the Indian Medical Department. Social status appears to have been of paramount importance to expatriate Britons, which has continued to the present day, and they were at pains to ensure that, with very few exceptions, all Anglo-Indians were restricted to middle management positions. Similarly, except as guests, they were excluded from most, if not all, the social clubs which the British inaugurate whenever they find themselves in a minority overseas. These people did, however, attain some quite exalted positions. Witness the trio of medals to Owen Roulash, who eventually became Postmaster General of Bihar and Orissa, with the honorary rank of Major in the Army. And he must have seen considerable service because he finished up with those 3 medals, 2 India General Service medals, and the one in the middle is for service during the First World War. Anglo-Indians formed the backbone of the Auxiliary Force India, a sort of Indian territorial army, formed like the TA for the purpose of home defence. They were particularly predominant in the railway battalions, and one of their members, Sergeant Arnold Barraclough, was to be awarded the Empire Gallantry Medal in 1930. Mr. Barraclough lived long enough to become a George Cross holder in 1940, when all living holders of the Empire Gallantry Medal were translated to the George Cross. Similarly, Mr. George Rodriguez, an assistant surgeon of the Indian Medical Department, had been amongst the earliest recipients of this decoration in 1923, when he won it for operations in Malabar. He too survived to become a George Cross holder in 1940. Mr. Barraclough died in England in 1974 and Mr. Rodriguez in Bangalore in 1962. There are several VCs among the Anglo-Indian community. Hospital apprentice, later apothecary Andrew Fitzgibbon, won the Victoria Cross at North Taku Fort, India in 1861, aged only 15 years and 10 months, while Guy Gibson has become internationally famous as the leader of the wartime raid on the dams in Germany. Fitzgibbon died in Delhi in 1883 and Guy Gibson was killed in action in 1944. There were 2 decorations in earlier years for gallantry performed not in the presence of an enemy, and several Anglo-Indians take their place in this pantheon of heroes, and there is one heroine. These decorations were the Albert and Edward medals. Both could be awarded in 2 classes, with the former being restricted to saving life at sea and on land, for each of which categories the medal differed in design and colour of ribbon. The Edward Medal, instituted in 1907 for mines and quarries, and in 1909 extended to industry generally, was for gallantry and saving life in those occupations. So far as I can ascertain, 2 Anglo-Indians were awarded the Albert Medal, current from 1866 to 1971, when it was superseded by the George Cross. One was James Carney, a railwayman on the East India Railway at Dinapur, who saved the life of a shunting porter in 1881, for which he received the Albert Medal of the 2nd class in bronze. And Mrs. Florence Emmett, the wife of the station master at Peshawar, Northwest Frontier Province, who assisted in the arrest of an armed fanatic who had attacked her husband and son, although she herself was stabbed. This took place in 1919 and was also a 2nd class award. Both these Albert medals are now in the collection of a collector in the United States of America. The Edward Medal recipients were James Johnston and James Kipling, overseer and undermanager, respectively, at Mopani Colliery of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, who saved a man after a roof fall in 1925. Johnston survived to become a George Cross and died in England in 1974. Both these men were awarded the Edward Medal in the second class in bronze. There were three others: Joseph de Souza, a charge man of the East India Railway workshops at Jamalpur in Bengal, who attempted to save the life of a labourer who had fallen into a cupola of melting pig iron in 1924. Albert Stroud, a guard on the East India Railway, who saved an elderly man from in front of a train at Buktiapur station in Bihar in 1912, and Cecil Whiffen, a miner of Gorrangdi Colliery, also on the, I think that's also on the East India Railways, who, with other miners, rescued two men after a roof fall in 1917, and he received the Edward Medal in Silver, first class, for this. Collecting British decorations and war medals is different from just about every other form of collecting. With the exception of those campaign stars and medals issued for service in World War II, all campaign awards issued by the British government carry the name of the recipient on the rim. Apart from the Victoria Cross, which is always issued named, some decorations awarded to officers were not issued named in former days, although they are now. For instance, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Military Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Force Cross. Although some of these earlier awards are found privately named. And conversely, some Commonwealth countries issued their World War II campaign stars and medals named to participants. It is always the exception that proves the rule. Once you have a name, it is possible to research the recipient. Officers are always easier to research than non-commissioned ranks, and civilians can be a bit of a nightmare. Some names, for example Smith, are more challenging than others. However, it is usually possible to discover something about the man or woman, the latter much more uncommon than the former, behind the medal. You will see from the examples I've brought along today that there is more information on some than others. It sometimes takes years to discover biographical details of recipients, and many and various are the methods used to obtain this information. When researching officers of the three services, one can begin by consulting any of the three lists, the Royal Navy list, the Army list, or the Royal Air Force list, which are published annually. If one has a medal, this establishes a rough starting point for consulting the appropriate list. So if you, for instance, you have this medal here, which is the India General Service 1908, with a bar for Afghanistan Northwest Frontier 1919, you could start with the Army list for 1919, with a fairly sure bet that you're going to find the chap's name in there somewhere. Until recent years, substantive warrant officers Class 1 were also included, but this no longer happens, presumably on the grounds of cost. From the chosen list, one can then work backwards and forwards as appropriate to establish the individual's date of commission, promotion and retirement. Lists used to include those who had died the previous year, but not the date, though this no longer appears, presumably also on the grounds of cost. The Army also published a gradation list, and from this one can discover an officer's progression through the ranks and some of the appointments he or she has held. Only regular officers, however, appear in the gradation list. There are no TA or short service officers, for example. The gradation list will also give details of gallantry awards, and in the case of these, the London Gazette date, which is always helpful. For British personnel, both commissioned and otherwise, the National Archives hold service records going back into the mists of time up to around 100 years ago. However, the majority of those relating to personnel who served during World War I were destroyed in the Blitz, although a very small number have survived, about a third, I believe. And some were heavily damaged but have been as well restored as possible, so that it's still possible to consult them. The India Office holds quite a lot of material on the Navy and Army, particularly relating to honours and awards, but individual service records are another matter. There are none appertaining to native Indians, though some do exist on members of the Indian Medical Service. Senior assistant surgeons of the Indian Medical Department are all listed, and later on in 1943, when the Indian Army Medical Corps was instituted, those who became members of this also appear. Now, presumably there were a lot of records in India, but I imagine the White Ant's got most of them. Some may still exist, but finding them would be a bit of a challenge, I imagine. Civilian organisations in India, such as the Postal and Telegraph Departments, produced their own lists in which those who had achieved sufficient seniority are to be found, and there are some examples in the folder there. I've brought along a couple of examples to accompany some of the medals. Similarly, you will see documents relating to the various members of the Indian Medical Department which tell us a little of the individual concerned and support the award of the medals. It's always important to support the award of medals, have provenance in other words, because there are a lot of fakes about. I've brought along a couple of medals with stories attached, one of which was awarded to a British soldier and the other to an Anglo-Indian. The first one is a fairly common India General Service Medal 1895 to 1902, with the clasps for Punjab Frontier 1897 and 1898 and the Relief of Chitral in 1895. This was to a humble private soldier called George Mitchell of the East Kent Regiment, now known as the Buffs. Many years ago I was researching for a book called Brave Railwaymen, and I went to see the last surviving Railway Victoria Cross, a man called Wilfred Wood. He kept his medals in an old bureau in a cardboard box, a VC mind you, and along with these was a very black medal with a very dirty ribbon attached, this one. I asked him whose medal this was, and he replied that it had been awarded to his wife's uncle. He married a Miss Bessie Mitchell, and if I would like it, I could have it. He insisted I took it, and I was very touched by his generosity, and it's probably the nearest I will ever come to having a VC in my collection. The second medal is again a fairly common award. This time it is the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal India, awarded to Assistant Surgeon C.F.H. Quick of the Indian Medical Department. Around March this year, I read a book review in the Mail on Sunday about a book by Diana Quick called A Tug on the Thread. This book. It mentioned her connection to the Indian Medical Services, and I immediately thought of the medal, which I've had only since September last year. After I acquired it, the medal, I wrote to the Society of Apothecaries to see if they could tell me anything about this man, and back came 2 sheets of A4 with lots of information, which is also in the folder. I resolved to obtain a copy of the book, and when it arrived, lo and behold, there is Assistant Surgeon Christopher Francis Henry Quick, Assistant Surgeon, Indian Medical Department, and the author's great-uncle. I wrote to Miss Quick informing her of my acquisition, and she sent a charming reply, which is also contained in the folder. I'd like to stay now for a bit with the Indian Medical Department, as this is the most interesting in many ways of the organisations of which Anglo-Indians became the mainstay. In the early days of the Honourable East India Company, there had been a requirement for medical personnel to serve with the army, and in the early 19th century, these things began to assume a more formal basis, with educated Anglo-Indians, or Eurasians as they were then known, being eligible to join the Indian Subordinate Medical Department as hospital apprentices. And you will recall I mentioned Hospital Apprentice Fitzgibbon, who won the Victoria Cross. And these hospital apprentices would have the opportunity for advancement to compounders and dressers, and later on appointments as apothecaries. The latter ranked as warrant officers first class, but subconductors and conductors, and later still they became sub-assistant surgeons, though still with warrant rank. And the warrant officer, for those who are unfamiliar with the army, is between non-commissioned officers and officers. They hold warrants from the Secretary of State, not from the Queen. Officers hold commissions for the Queen, warrant officers hold warrants from the Secretary of State. They can't be reduced in rank other than by court-martial. Not till much later did they become eligible for commissions. By the 1890s, things had advanced sufficiently for the department to drop the appellation sub from its title, and the appointment of apothecary was changed to that of assistant surgeon. with 4th and 3rd class assistant surgeons being ranked as Warrant Officer 1's subconductor, and the 2nd and 1st class assistant surgeons being described as conductors. As well as Anglo-Indians, there were also large numbers of native-born Indians in their ranks, both Hindu and Muslim. Some of these men achieved high British medical qualifications. Many of them came to England and studied for English medical exams and became MRCS, LRCPs and a number of other DPMs, Diploma in Psychiatric Medicine, DTMs, Diploma in Tropical Medicine. Some of them had very high qualifications. But just before the First World War, in 1910, assistant surgeons became eligible for commissions as senior assistant surgeons, this being effectively a Viceroy's commission. Their initial appointment was as a lieutenant. In due course, they could advance to captain and then major. I believe a very few became lieutenant colonels, and even fewer apparently managed to transition to the Indian Medical Services, which was the British counterpart of the IMD. The idea was that the Indian Medical Service treated the Brits and the Indian Medical Department treated the native soldiers. It didn't always happen like that, fortunately, but that was the official position. The IMD, the IMS also boasted a fair number of native-born Indians, even to the end of the Raj, again with high British medical qualifications. However, even the most senior of the senior assistant surgeons ranked below the most junior British officer. So in other words, a senior assistant surgeon with a rank of major with perhaps 30 years service would be subordinate to the most junior wet behind ears recently arrived British second lieutenant. Another curious fact is that they were not officially permitted to treat Europeans, although there is evidence that they did in emergencies when there was nobody else available. And I suppose that if one were in extremis, one wouldn't be too concerned about who rolled up to treat them. All these medical personnel served in civilian hospitals in India, as well as with the Indian Army and the Royal Indian Marine. They could also, of course, be posted to serve overseas on active service, and they served in the South African War of 1899 to 1902, China 1900, and both World Wars, where they performed with distinction. 41 members of the Indian Medical Department were decorated for gallantry and distinguished service in World War I, being awarded 2 MBEs, 13 Indian Orders of Merit, 10 military crosses, 2 Associates of the Royal Red Cross, and 13 Indian Distinguished Service Medals. Of these, 14 went to Anglo-Indians. The 2 ARRCs went to Anglo-Indian nurses of the Indian Army Nursing Service for service in Mesopotamia, while the 2 MBEs went to 2 majors who were senior assistant surgeons for services as prisoners of war. All the remainders were assistant surgeons of various grades. I've brought along with me today for you to examine, if you wish to do so, the medals of 8 assistant surgeons and 1 temporary nurse. This is the nurse's medal. Service in Iraq. Now, then known as Mesopotamia, but it's got the bar on it for Iraq. She's entitled to 2 First World War medals as well, but I haven't got those. The majority of these medals are for service in India, but they include medals for service in China and World War I. China is, where has he gone? There he is. China is the one on the right there, China 1900. And World War I is the one you've already seen for the assistant Postmaster General, that one, which was also issued in bronze to members of assorted camp followers, really, if you might call them. This particular one was issued to the Army Bearer Corps, which was part of the Indian Army, who were, of course, stretcher bearers. But it was also issued in bronze to the Maltese Labour Corps, the Chinese Labour Corps, and it's very much rarer than the one in silver. 4 of the assistant surgeons' medals that you see here went on to be commissioned, and one eventually became a captain in the Indian Army Medical Corps during World War II, this one. He actually survived to become a real-life captain. You'll see that I've managed to trace the grandson of one of these men in Australia, if you have a look at the documents. And I've also traced relatives of him. This is Charles Stowell, who is not an Indian Medical Department, but was in the Postal Department. I've also traced relatives of his in England. There is so much scope for research with these items, and it gives one a real buzz when one manages to trace people's antecedents. Anglo-Indians managed to serve in all kinds of unexpected places. For example, railwaymen were sent out to East Africa during World War I and gained medals there for their war service as civilians with the railways. There are a number of medals issued to people who were guards, for instance. It's a sad fact of the medal enthusiast's life that groups of medals are frequently split up, often after the death of the recipient, and when his or her effects are being disposed of. This is true of at least 2 of the medals I've brought. In one case, that of Nurse McGregor, as I just mentioned, there are 2 World War I medals missing, and in another one, that of Assistant Surgeon Beveridge, whose medal is this one. There are at least 3 other medals missing with this one, and possibly as many as half a dozen. I know some of them I'm told some of them appeared on eBay earlier this year. Very occasionally one is lucky and manages to reunite groups, but more often than not it just doesn't happen. In the case of Mr. Quick's medal, I was able to find out more about him than the others because he had letters after his name, MRCS and LMSSA. That's Licentiate of the Medicine and Surgery of the Society of Apothecaries of England, who are based here in London. I wrote to the Society of Apothecaries and they came back with quite a lot of information about him, not contained in army records. This, of course, was before I was in contact with Diana Quick, such as when and where he had taken his examinations and even who his father was. It was this last piece of information that confirmed that he was indeed related to Diana Quick. The British being what they were, qualifications obtained in Britain were more highly regarded than those obtained in India. With regard to those medals awarded to members of the Postal and Telegraph departments, of which there are several here, we were able to discover quite a lot about their careers from the official government directories which were produced, dealing with the more senior members of staff. However, these unfortunately do not tell us anything at all about the individual's private life, and one has to try and find this out as best one can. I generally resort to putting adverts in organs such as the FIBIS journal and similar publications in the hope that someone will recognise a name and respond. So far, this has only resulted in one response from a distant relative in Cornwall, who kindly provided some valuable biographical information on Charles Alexander Stowell of the Postal Department, this gentleman. Who was awarded the India General Service Medal 1895 with 3 clasps. So he must have seen some serious action on the Northwest frontier during the 1890s. He was then a superintendent 4th grade, later 2nd grade. He was born in 1868 and died in Lahore in 1928. There were apparently relatives of his living in England in the mid-1990s, and I have just unearthed another one in Leicestershire, who asked me if I would send him a copy of Charles Stowell's medal, which I did. Medals given for long service and good conduct or for meritorious service were for just that. Their award was confined to non-commissioned ranks, since it was presumed that these attributes went without saying for officers. Thus most, if not all, the assistant surgeons would have qualified for at least the former. Time qualifications have varied over the years, but for the majority it would have involved a minimum of 18 years service without blemish. While the Indian Army originally had its own version of the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal for award to Europeans, instituted in 1848. This was abolished in 1873 and the standard British Army medal replaced it. The one on the right there is the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal. There was a separate version for the Indian members of the Army, including the Anglo-Indians, this being instituted in 1888. And this was not actually abolished until independence in 1947, although it appears that at least some members of the Indian Medical Department received the British medal, and that one there that I've just shown you is in fact the British one. Both the title and appearance of this medal changed in 1930, when a fixed suspension bar was added, bearing the names of the various Commonwealth countries, like this one. This one to Mr. Quick has got the bar with India on it. But there were other varieties with Canada and Australia and New Zealand and things like that on them. And the British version just has regular army on that bar. But I've got two versions of the Indian one here today. One's George V, which is that one, and the other one is George VI to Eric Wynne. Members of the Indian Army, both British and Indian, were involved in campaigns in countries bordering India during the 19th century, and these included Nepal, Burma, Malaya, Assam, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Sikkim, Tibet, and even Persia. And they were, in fact, also sent to various countries in Africa. They also served in Egypt, Sudan, and Abyssinia, and got medals for them. In some cases, separate medals were issued for these countries, but in others they appear as clasps to the appropriate India General Service Medal. For instance, this 1854 India General Service Medal had a bar, an early bar given to it with Perak written on it, which of course is one of the states of Malaysia. Malaya as it then was. So the India General Service was actually given for service in Malaya. Of course, members of the Indian Army were heavily involved in just about all theatres during both world wars, as well as in India itself, India being seriously threatened with an invasion by the Japanese. Many Indian troops therefore qualified for the Burma and Pacific Stars, in addition to the War Medal and the India Service Medal. Curiously, the northwest frontier seems to remain fairly quiet from 1939 to 45. Styles of naming are many and various, medals being found with impressed and engraved naming, both to British and Indian troops. Engraved naming tends to be in running script and often finely done, particularly this one here. The first one here is beautifully engraved with this man's name and rank. Not that one, sorry. It's, where is he? This one. Where here he is named as an assistant apothecary, A.G. Bowder, in the medical department. And they were generally very well done by the local engraver. The last two India General Service Medals, those for 1908 and 1936, and I haven't got the 1936 one here, were issued with two types of suspender. The suspender is the bit that connects the medal with the ribbon, this curly whirly bit here, or sometimes a straight bar like that we have with the bronze medal here. But there were two different types. There was the British type, issued by the Royal Mint, and that had a much neater fitting, it's visible on the long surface of the Comet medal, had a much neater fitting attaching the suspender to the medal. It had like scroll shoulders here with a nice neat rivet through it, whereas the Calcutta Mint specimens are a bit more untidy. That's a Calcutta Mint one with the sort of a security. I don't know how you explain it, how you describe that really, but it's not nearly as neat anyway. You can see the difference. From the Burma 1885 to 1887 class, to the IGS 1854, this one, to the Arbor 1911-12 medal, to this one, medals and clasps were issued in bronze to approved camp followers such as bearers and water carriers and drivers and the myriad camp followers that the Indian Army had. But if they were enlisted followers, as they usually were, they were allocated numbers, and this guy here has got a number. He was a cook in the Army Bearer Corps, and he was given the number 577, so he was an enlisted follower, but they had to be enlisted followers. The bronze medals and clasps were awarded to certain Indian personnel for their participation in campaigns in South Africa. This one, that's the Boer War, the bronze medal for the Boer War, to a Jemadar in the Supply and Transport Corps, later the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. They were also awarded silver medals for the Boer War, but that particular one is one of the 2,500 awarded to the S&T Corps in bronze. They were also awarded bronze medals for the China campaign, 1900, the one on the right there. The campaigns in Africa, I haven't got any African medals to Indian personnel. 6 of the 45 clasps to the Africa General Service 1902 medal were in bronze, and Tibet 1905 was a bronze issue to the enlisted camp followers. Many of the early medals given for service in India are rare and therefore valuable. In the case of others, while the medal itself might not be particularly uncommon, some of the clasps awarded for campaigns are of the highest rarity and therefore, being much sought after, command a premium. This one here, the India General Service Medal 1908 to 1935, a common medal in itself. One of the bars issued for this was Waziristan 1925. It was only awarded to about 100 personnel of the Royal Air Force, and you pay 4 figures for that today. Whereas this one is a fairly commonplace one, and to the average foot soldier you probably pay what, £100 for it, something like that. Again, multiple clasp medals and unusual combinations of clasps tend to enjoy an enhanced value. There are many such examples just with the medals given for India. Similarly, a particular action, such as the defence of Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny, now called in India, I believe, the First War of Independence, or the behaviour of an individual unit, such as the last stand of the 66th Foot, later the Royal Berkshire Regiment, at Maiwand in Afghanistan in 1881, will also be more valuable and sought after. And I've mentioned already the Waziristan clasp for the IGOS 1908. India there was the first theatre, in fact, in which the RAF was used in earnest, as of course the service had only been in existence then for about 7 years, so it was very much a fledgling organisation. Subsequently, they were to do quite a lot of flying in India between the wars, but in the early days, that was, I think, the first clasp awarded to the RAF for service in India. It may be fitting to conclude by reading a few citations for selected awards for gallantry, and I shall begin with the preeminent award of the Victoria Cross. Only 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded between the 2 world wars. All save one were for service in India, and all save one were posthumous. And I've chosen as the illustrative award that to the survivor, Sepoy Ishar Singh of the 18th Punjabis of the Indian Army. And it reads as follows. For most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty on the 10th of April 1921, near Haidari Kach in Waziristan. Forgive my pronunciation, I'm not an expert on the language. When the convoy protection troops were attacked, this sepoy was number 1 of a Lewis gun section. Early in the action, he received a very severe gunshot wound in the chest and fell beside his Lewis gun. Hand-to-hand fighting having commenced, British officer, Indian officer, and all the havildars of his company were either killed or wounded, and his Lewis gun was seized by the enemy. Calling up 2 other men, he got up, charged the enemy, recovered the Lewis gun, and although bleeding profusely, again got the gun into action. When his Jemadar arrived, he took the gun from Sepoy Ishar Singh and ordered him to go back and have his wound dressed. Instead of doing this, the sepoy went to the medical officer. Presumably, would have been a member of the Indian Medical Department. And he was of great assistance in pointing out where the wounded were and in carrying water to them. He made innumerable journeys to the river and back for this purpose. On one occasion, when the enemy fire was very heavy, he took the rifle of a wounded man and helped to keep down the fire. On another occasion, he stood in front of the medical officer who was dressing a wounded man, thus shielding him with his body. It was over 3 hours before he finally submitted to be evacuated, being then too weak from loss of blood to object. His gallantry and devotion to duty were beyond praise. His conduct inspired all who saw him. And that was published in the London Gazette, 25th of November 1921. This gallant man subsequently became a captain, also being awarded the PVSM India, and died at Nenwan, Punjab on the 2nd of December 1963, aged 67. Although a few direct awards of the Georgia Cross as opposed to exchange awards have been made to Indian subjects, none has been awarded for service in India. However, as stated earlier, almost 50 awards of the Albert and Edward medals for gallantry not in the presence of an enemy have been made for bravery in India. Before the institution of the George Cross, the Albert Medal was considered to be the civilian VC. And although it was originally and primarily intended for civilians who saved or attempted to save life at sea or on land, many service personnel received it, particularly in World War I. 16 ladies received it, of the total of 571 awards between 1866 and 1971, when it was superseded by the George Cross. And it is one of these that I've chosen as my illustrative award. The London Gazette of the 17th of August 1920 contained the following announcement. The King has been pleased to award the Albert Medal to Mrs. Emmett, wife of Mr. Frederick Emmett, Station Master of Peshawar, in recognition of her gallant conduct on the occasion of a murderous attack upon her husband and son in December last. You may recall I mentioned earlier on. On December the 7th, 1919, Mrs. Emmett and her children were sitting with her husband, who was in bed with fever. The eldest boy, aged 17, had occasion to go into the sitting room, and as he entered the room, he found an Indian coming in from the garden. On the boy questioning the man as to what he was doing, the intruder immediately attacked him with an axe, breaking the boy's forearm. The boy closed with his assailant, and on his mother coming into the room, she found that the man, who had dropped the axe, was stabbing her son with a dagger. She at once rushed to her son's assistance and seized the man, never relaxing her hold, in spite of receiving a stab in her side. At this stage, her husband came from his sickbed to the rescue. The Indian wrenched himself free from Mrs. Emmett and stabbed Mr. Emmett in the thigh. Thereupon, Mrs. Emmett again seized the man by the wrist, and in spite of receiving several more wounds on her hand and arm, succeeded in getting hold of the handle of the dagger. Eventually, with the aid of some servants, the assailant was overpowered, and Mrs. Emmett continued to show the greatest courage by ignoring her own wounds until both her husband and son had been attended to and sent to hospital. All three have now recovered, and their assailant, who proved to be a murderous fanatic, was tried, sentenced and duly hanged. There can be no doubt that Mrs. Emmett's bravery saved her son's life and probably her husband's too. Unfortunately, I know nothing at all about Mrs. Emmett, save for what is contained in the citation. I do know, however, that her Albert Medal is now in the collection of a correspondent of mine who lives in the United States. Lastly, an award of the Edward Medal, an example of the Edward Medal. This was instituted in 1907 for bravery in mines and quarries, and later in 1909 extended to gallant acts in industry generally. It was awarded in silver and bronze, first and second class, and was colloquially known as the Miners' VC. Like the Albert Medal, it was superseded by the George Cross for all those recipients surviving in October 71. It was awarded 23 times for acts of gallantry in India. His Majesty the King has been pleased to award the Edward Medal of the second class, i.e. in bronze, to Mr. Albert Edward Stroud under the following circumstances. On the 11th of July last, Stroud, who is a guard on the East India Railway, was employed on special duty at Buktiapur station and was engaged in controlling a large crowd of pilgrims. Just as a passenger train was entering the station, an elderly Indian woman jumped onto the line intending to cross. Stroud at once jumped after her, and though she had fallen, succeeded in dragging her out of the way of the train. That's London Gazette, 27th of May 1913. As with Florence Emmett, I know nothing of Albert Stroud other than what is contained in the citation. However, he has undoubtedly left his mark on the history of India, and he, like all the others, should not be forgotten. I began this presentation by saying this is a vast subject, and I've only just managed to scratch the surface in the time available, but I hope I've managed to whet the appetite of some of you to discover more. This is a subject that bites one, as it were, and the more you know, the more you want to know. In addition to the medals, I've also brought along, as I say, some relevant service records and a couple of books dealing with the subject of research, and these are on display with the medals. Elaine has details of these books, and if anybody would like them, then I'm sure she'll be pleased to get them for you. And these are there if anybody wants to have a look at them. As you may have guessed, another of my interests is railways, and it's no coincidence that two of the citations I read out a short time ago are for railway personnel. Many of the poor children of India are from railway families, and descendants of British soldiers of long ago. I try to do my bit for these children by donating to Dr. Graham's homes in Kalimpong. It's a sobering thought, for we have so much to realise that for these children the price of a night out is a sum beyond the wildest dreams of most of them. And I've brought some leaflets along for anyone who might be interested in it. Thank you for your attention. If anyone now has any questions, I shall do my best to answer them. But I am not a great expert on foreign decorations. Please don't ask me anything about foreign decorations. Thank you very much. Welcome to come and look at these medals if you wish to do so, with the Chairman's permission.
What a fascinating story. Stories of bravery of that sort. Would the lady there like to ask a question?
Yes. My grandfather was given the Empire Medal by George and Mary in 1936. It wasn't for gallantry, but I think it was for general services to India. So I don't know whether you can give me any guidance or information on that.
You should be able to get his citation from the appropriate London Gazette if you know roughly when he was. You'd have to trawl through it if you didn't know when he got it. You don't know why he got it?
Yeah, so he had a motor business, a transport business, and he obviously did a lot for opening up the interior in the way of buses and lorries and things like that.
Do you have a rough idea of when he got it?
It's 1936.
36, right. So that's the end of the 80s, wasn't it? Although it is presumably a George V medal because there were only about 2 medals issued with George VIII's medal.
Right.
You need the London Gazette, supplements the London Gazette for 1936, and in there it'll be either New Year honours for January, or it'll be birthday honours for June 36. So you want one of those two, I suspect. Find the relevant Gazette and there you will find the citation for it. I believe that these, at least some of these gazettes are on the web now. And you can get them online and you can get it printed off. That's where you should be able to find it. It'll be the civil issue, 1936. 1936 will have the original ribbon on, the original purple ribbon.
I haven't seen that ribbon at all. I've just seen this.
It's got the pink and pearl grey stripes on.
I don't remember, I just remember seeing the medal.
Yeah, the ribbon changed in 1936 when Queen Mary became patron of the order. They changed it from purple to the present one, which is pearl grey with pink with pearl grey stripes down it, with a central pearl grey stripe for the military awards, and the old British Empire medal had a red stripe down the purple for the military awards. But yours could be either actually, because you were entitled to change the ribbon if you wanted to do so, if you were still around when they changed the ribbon. So he could be wearing it on either ribbon. Either ribbon would be correct.
This gentleman here, please.
Yes, you made a passing reference to fake medals. How is the unwary?
Dear, bit of a minefield this. I didn't. Well, there are various doctoring can be done to medals. I haven't got any examples here, but first of all, you get the straight fake. There are cottage industries in this country and various other places churning these things out. I had one not long ago. I had a military medal not long ago to a nurse in the First World War, supposedly. And when I sought a second opinion, my friend came back and said, "This medal is total fake." And I paid £2,500 for it. I mean, women's military medals in the First World War are that price. Came complete with copy of London Gazette, the name on it tallied, and so I wrote to the dealer I got it off and said, "What do you think of it so far?" And he sent me a cheque back for £2,500. So he bore the loss. But that was an outright fake. There was somebody in a garden shed somewhere turning these things out and putting correct names on them too. I mean, if you want to get into this sort of thing, you collect not faking medals. If you want to get into collecting medals, you start with a reputable dealer. Because with a reputable dealer, they sort of there's an unspoken guarantee that if you buy a medal from a dealer and it then turns out not to be what was advertised, you send it back to him and he refunds your money and he stands the loss because they can't claim it on insurance either. So £2,500. This guy's £2,500 out of pocket. But there are doctored medals. You have to be aware of those. For instance, you can take a fairly commonplace India General Service Medal like this, I mean, these are not uncommon. They're expensive, but they're not uncommon. You could take a bar off that, and you could put a bar on it for the Chin Hills. Now, if you put a bar on it for the Chin Hills, it immediately shoots up several noughts. Or the Catching Hills is another one to the Norfolks, I think it is. The Chin Hills to the Yorkshires and the Catching Hills to the Norfolks. These all happen to be to Indian personnel, but the unscrupulous will do this, and particularly with the very early medals, which are difficult to check, like the Naval General Service Medal for the Napoleonic Wars, where the most common bar was for Syria, and there are several people on the rolls which are very unreliable, with common names like John Jones, for instance. And the unscrupulous will remove the Syria bar and put on it a bar for Trafalgar. Now that ups it with a good many more noughts. I mean, a Trafalgar medal, you won't buy a Trafalgar medal for under 5,000. Probably a lot more. But with Syria on it, you'll get it for 500, I suppose. But there's all sorts of things people can do with it. They can rename them. There was a cottage industry in Plymouth a few years back that were busy renaming medals. And there were two chaps who were prosecuted for having a press, a stamping machine, for stamping medals. Impressed, as they call it. This one's impressed. You could tell the difference, because impressed are always in block capitals. And these guys were running a cottage industry and pressing Waterloo medals. I mean, Waterloo medals cost an arm and a leg. And there they were in their sort of garden shed, churning these things out. And they were prosecuted for it because the medal dealers of the world were up in arms. So there are some medals that are issued unnamed, and then they get these medals and put a name on it from, like the SAS. And SAS is very fashionable, so you name it to the SAS. Immediately several noughts go on the end to an otherwise common medal. There's all sorts of pitfalls. So the answer is, if you want to get into it, you need to start with a reputable dealer and somebody who knows what they're doing. But it is very interesting. These, I believe, are all genuine.
Denise, if I may just request everybody, I know there's a certain amount of whispering going on, which is a little more than whispering in some cases. And it may be that the people at the back can't hear. So I wonder if you could be good enough, at least while the questions being asked, to turn that down a bit. Denise, you
shout louder.
Are the medals given during the Indian Mutiny and after that, are they rare and are they named?
Yes. Well, A, they're not rare as per se, and B, they are named, or should be. In fact, there are civilian medals to people in the Indian Mutiny, which are named. The trouble with the Indian Mutiny, a lot of the Indian Mutiny medals only have the names on them. They don't have any ranks, and they sometimes only have the regiments. So you have to go back to the medal rolls, which are in the TNA now, and consult the medal rolls to verify that the medal was awarded to that individual. They tend just to have the name like John Smith written on them, so you really have to go back to the medal rolls to decide who it was awarded to. Now, talking of rarity for the Indian Mutiny, I think I mentioned that if you've got an Indian Mutiny with a Defence of Lucknow bar on it, they're very peculiar bars, the Indian Mutiny medals, probably in the book at the back about campaign medals. Thank you very much. They have one on the what's called fishtail bars, the Indian Mutiny medal. If you get one of those to an original defender as opposed to one of the relievers, you're going to end up with several noughts on the end. They are rare and very valuable and expensive. More expensive, it has to be said, with these particular medals, medals generally to the British recipients are worth more than the medals to the Indian recipients. And that doesn't apply in this case, curiously enough. This is the British War Medal. Now, the British War Medal in silver, middle one there, there were over 6 million of those issued. So, for the average foot soldier, you pick them up for 25, 30 quid. But there were only 110,000 of those issued. So, you're going to be paying 3 figures for this, even to a cook in the Army Bearer Corps, because they are so much rarer that it's one of the anomalies where the bronze medal is much rarer than the silver variety. So, yes, they are named, and the Defence of Lucknow is the one to look out for.
And there's a picture in the book if you want to find it.
No plugging, please.
Yes, Sylvie.
I've been trying to find out whether an account of my dad's cousin, William George Charles, or George Charles, is true. I would have given up long ago if it's not for the fact his story appears in Frank Anthony's book, Britain's Betrayal in India, and the earlier version is in, I think, Melvin Brown's book, These Are the Anglo-Indians. And it says that this chap, either George Charles or William George Charles, was awarded the military medal for his exploits behind the lines during World War II in Burma. Now, I can find nothing in official records about him. And as I say, it's only the fact that it's in these two books about the Anglo-Indians, and these are supposedly the heroes of the Anglo-Indian community, the fact he's in there.
Regiment?
We know nothing about him. One of my friends down there thinks he could have been serving something called Force 136, Section B, but the books erroneously say he's a commander.
But of course he must have been a regiment. Force 136 would have been a unit. He must, sort of like a brigade or division out. Force 136 was one of the
But you see,
clandestine.
one goes round in a circle with this, but just any
right.
suggestions.
Military medals, Second World War. Hen's teeth, well, not actually Hen's teeth, but there were 115,000 given for the First World War. Which is
This is Second World War.
There were far, far less given for the Second World War. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I know it was far less for the Second World War, and consequently, to buy a Second World War military medal, you are talking about a lot more money than the First World War one. But unlike the First World War military medals, where citations are as rare as the dung of the rocking horse, Second World War military medals all had citations with them. Quite different. The First World War, they tended to come out in batches. They were just awarded for bravery in the field, and they came out in clumps in the London Gazette. No citations attached to them. The Second World War is different. They all have citations. Now, he should be, if he's anywhere, it should be in the London Gazette. So, have you been through the London Gazette indices?
I've done the thing online.
Indices? Have you tried a researcher?
Well, I'm supposedly a professional archivist.
Well, yeah. with all due respect, but no, I've had a researcher digging around for me with these things for several years now, and I was only told fairly recently that he subcontracts, as it were, and so I went to another researcher. I got hold of an old friend of mine called Tim Ash, who you may know, because he's connected with the Indian Military Historical Society. What Tim doesn't know about Indian medals isn't worth knowing. And I said, do you know anybody who does India? And he put me onto this chap down Chelmsford way somewhere, a chap called Ron Windybank. And Ron Windybank has dug up all sorts of things on some of these people that Jonathan Collins didn't. He used to pass it on to somebody else apparently, saying, you go and have a look, see if you can find anything. And they'd come back and they'd flip the first page over and say, oh, we can't find anything here. They go back to Jonathan Collins and say, oh, we can't find anything. And he'd write back to me, charge me 20 quid, say, we can't find anything. Well, Rob Windybank produces the goods. So, you know, with all due respect to, I know you and your reputation, which is well earned, but there's two edges often better than one. It's worth a try.
Well, if it wasn't for the fact it appears in these two books, I would have written it off as a family story.
IWM? Have you been
That's
there?
where they suggested it could be Force 136.
IWM for the two world wars, IWM. But it's funny, you see, Diana Condell, another friend of mine from years back, who was, when museums had people in there who did it because they loved doing what they did, and if you gave them a question, they would ferret about until they found the answer. And museums now, regrettably, are full of graduates who are merely using it as a stepping stone from one job to another, and do not have the love of the job that these people, these old people, older generation had. They weren't highly qualified, they sold it on for years in the same grade, but they knew what they were doing. Rose Coombs, my old friend, you remember my friend Rose Coombs, the late Rose Coombs, who, what she didn't know about World War I and the battlefield was not worth knowing. And you could ask her anything about that, she would give you the answer off the top of her head.
She wasn't highly qualified. She was a lowly civil servant in the IWS, Special Collections Officer for years. But she was typical of her generation, and the museums used to be full of these people who loved what they were doing. But now they're just jobsless now, which is a pity. There are exceptions, but the majority of them are jobsless.
I went to the museum.
But you belong to the sort of Rose Coombs generation, really. These youngsters don't have the love of the job. Try the IWS.
But I say, ladies and gentlemen, there are a few things better than an interesting talk. We just had a particularly interesting one, and that is one of them is a cup of tea.
That's more like it. Right, take this away.
So may I ask you to express your appreciation